Margaret Chen thought she'd found her dream home until HOA President Linda Hartwell declared war over 6 inches of fence height. What started as a simple property dispute exploded into a neighborhood battle that would expose decades of corruption, destroy reputations, and force Margaret to choose between her principles and her family's safety. But when Linda made the fatal mistake of threatening Margaret's autistic son, she unleashed something far more dangerous than any HOA violation. A mother's fury with the morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as Margaret Chen knelt beside her prized rose garden, carefully pruning the thorns from her latest bloom. The pink petals caught the light like silk, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe this might actually be paradise. 6 months ago, she and her husband David had scraped together every penny for the down payment on their colonial-style home, drawn by the promise of good schools and safe streets for their 8-year-old son, Kevin. "Mom, look," Kevin's voice rang out from the backyard, filled with the pure joy that only came when he discovered something new in nature. Margaret smiled, knowing he'd probably found another interesting bug or rock formation. His autism made him hyper-aware of details others missed, turning their modest quarter-acre into an endless source of wonder. The sound of heels clicking aggressively on concrete shattered the peaceful morning. Margaret looked up to see Linda Hartwell marching across the lawn, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, her lips pressed into a thin line of barely contained rage. As president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, Linda had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial enforcer, and Margaret had learned to dread these impromptu visits. "Mrs. Chen," Linda's voice dripped with false politeness, "we need to talk." Margaret stood slowly, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "Good morning, Linda. What can I do for you?" "It's about your fence." Linda gestured toward the 6-foot privacy fence that separated Margaret's backyard from the common area behind the houses. "I've received complaints." "Complaints?" Margaret's stomach tightened. She'd researched every HOA regulation before installing the fence, double-checking measurements and materials. From whom? Linda's smile was razor-sharp. "That's confidential. But I'm here to inform you that your fence violates HOA regulations. It's 6 inches too tall. That's impossible." Margaret pulled out her phone, scrolling to the saved photos of the HOA guidelines. Section 4.2 clearly states that privacy fences can be up to 6 feet in height. I measured it myself. The regulation was updated last month. Linda produced a crisp folder from her oversized purse. New maximum height is 5 feet 6 inches. You'll need to remove the fence or lower it by next Friday. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. The document looked official, complete with letterhead and signatures, but something felt wrong. The language was stilted, the formatting slightly off. "I didn't receive notice of this change. It was posted on the community bulletin board." Linda's tone suggested the matter was settled. "Ignorance of the rules isn't an excuse. The bulletin board that's been broken." "For 3 months," Margaret's voice rose. "The one with the cracked glass that no one can read." Kevin appeared at the back door, his dark eyes wide with anxiety. Changes in routine or raised voices always unsettled him, and Margaret could see the familiar signs of an impending meltdown. She forced herself to speak calmly. "Kevin, sweetie, why don't you go count your rock collection? I'll be in soon." He nodded and disappeared back inside. But Margaret knew he was listening. He always listened. "Mrs. Chen," Linda continued, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I understand this is inconvenient, but rules are rules. The fence blocks the view from my kitchen window, and frankly, several neighbors have mentioned it's rather imposing." The truth hit Margaret like a physical blow. This wasn't about regulations at all. Linda's house sat on a slight hill behind theirs, and the fence blocked her view of the small pond and walking trail that had made the neighborhood so appealing. Margaret had installed it specifically to give Kevin a safe space to play, without curious stares from neighbors who didn't understand his stimming behaviors or occasional outbursts. "You're upset because you can't see the pond from your window," Margaret said quietly. "I'm upset because rules are being broken." Linda's mask of politeness began to slip, "and I'm frankly tired of having to explain myself to someone who clearly doesn't understand how a proper neighborhood functions." The casual cruelty in Linda's tone ignited something deep in Margaret's chest. She'd spent years dealing with Kevin's teachers, doctors, and therapists who talked around her instead of to her, who assumed she was somehow less capable because her son was different. She'd moved to Willowbrook specifically to escape that kind of judgment. "I want to see the meeting minutes where this change was approved," Margaret said firmly. "And I want to know exactly who complained about my fence." Linda's eyes narrowed. "You're not entitled to that information. The HOA board operates at its discretion, and our decisions are final." Actually, according to the HOA bylaws, homeowners have the right to review all board decisions and meeting minutes. Margaret had read every word of the governing documents. "After their first run-in with Linda over their mailbox color, I'm requesting a formal review of this decision." "Fine." Linda's voice turned arctic. "But understand this, Mrs. Chen. I've been managing this neighborhood for 12 years. I know every regulation, every exception, every loophole. And I know how to deal with troublemakers who think they can waltz in here and ignore our community standards." She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving Margaret standing in her garden with shaking hands and a growing sense of dread. Through the kitchen window, she could see Kevin sitting at the table, methodically arranging his rocks by size and color. The fence had given him the freedom to play outside without hiding, without worrying about the neighbors' stares or comments. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed her husband's number. "David, it's me. We have a problem." 20 minutes later, David Chen's Honda Civic pulled into their driveway with unusual urgency. A software engineer who approached every problem with methodical precision. David had initially dismissed Margaret's concerns about Linda as typical neighbor drama. But as he read through the folder Linda had left behind, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is fake," he said finally. "What do you mean? The document formatting is all wrong. Look at the signatures there. Digital copies, not originals. And this date, ... He pointed to the approval stamp. "That's a Saturday. The HOA board meets on Tuesdays." Margaret felt a mix of relief and fury. So she's lying. More than that, she's forging official documents. David's fingers flew over his laptop keyboard. "I'm checking the county records for any actual regulation changes, and I'm going to find out who else is on this board." As David worked, Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Kevin play in their backyard. He was spinning in circles, his arms outstretched, completely absorbed in the sensation of movement. The fence gave him privacy for these moments of pure joy, protecting him from the judgment of neighbors who didn't understand that stimming wasn't something to be fixed or hidden. "Margaret," David's voice was tight with anger, "you need to see this." She looked over his shoulder at the computer screen, which displayed the HOA's official website. The board of directors listed only 3 names: Linda Hartwell, president; Richard Hartwell, vice president; and Susan Hartwell, secretary. "They're all related," Margaret breathed. "It gets worse." David clicked to another tab. "I found the original HOA documents filed with the county. The board is supposed to have 7 members elected by the homeowners. There hasn't been an election in 8 years. Margaret sank into a chair as the implications hit her. She's been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom and collecting HOA fees from 67 households. David's jaw clenched. At $200 per month, that's over $160,000 per year, all flowing through accounts controlled by her family. Through the window, Margaret watched Kevin carefully arrange his rocks in a perfect spiral pattern. His concentration was absolute, his movements precise and purposeful. He was happy here, safe here, and Linda Hartwell wanted to take that away because it blocked her view of a pond. "What do we do?" Margaret asked. David closed the laptop and met her eyes. "We go to war." That evening, Margaret sat in her living room with a growing pile of documents spread across the coffee table: property records, HOA bylaws, financial statements, and a growing list of neighbors' phone numbers. David had reached out to 5 other homeowners, each of whom had their own story of harassment, arbitrary fines, and impossible demands from Linda. The Johnsons had been fined $500 for having the wrong shade of brown on their front door. The Patels received a violation notice for their daughter's chalk art on the sidewalk. The Martinezes were threatened with a lien on their property for parking their work truck in their own driveway. "She's been systematically bullying anyone who doesn't fit her vision of the perfect neighborhood," Margaret told David as they reviewed the evidence, "and using fake regulations to do it." David nodded grimly. "One found Summith The first news van arrived at 6:47 a.m., its bright Channel 7 logo gleaming in the morning sun. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as reporter Jessica Martinez stepped out, her camera crew already setting up equipment on the sidewalk. By 7:15, two more vans had joined the first, and neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity. Linda Hartwell's reaction was immediate and predictable. Margaret saw her burst from her front door in a silk bathrobe, her perfectly styled hair in curlers, marching toward the news crews with the fury of a woman whose carefully constructed world was crumbling. "You have no right to be here." Linda's voice carried across the neighborhood. "This is private property." Jessica Martinez, a seasoned reporter who'd covered everything from city council corruption to corporate fraud, didn't flinch, ma'am. "We're on public property." "Are you Linda Hartwell, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA?" "I have nothing to say to you people. We have documents suggesting you've been operating an illegal HOA board and forging official documents. Would you care to comment?" Linda's face went white, then red. "Those are lies, slander. I'll sue you and that Chen woman for everything you're worth." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David, watching from the office. "She's digging her own grave. Stay calm." By 8 a.m., the story had exploded across social media. The hashtag #FenceGate was trending locally, with neighbors sharing their own Linda Hartwell horror stories. The Johnsons posted photos of their $500 fine for the wrong door color. The Patels shared video of Linda screaming at their 6-year-old daughter for drawing flowers in chalk. The Martinezes revealed they'd been paying double HOA fees for 2 years after. Linda claimed their Hispanic surname indicated they were likely to have multiple families in one unit. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Interview requests, support from disability rights groups, and calls from neighbors she'd never met, all sharing stories of Linda's systematic harassment. But it was the call from Detective Sarah Williams that changed everything. "Mrs. Chen, I'm with the County Fraud Division. We've received your complaint about forged HOA documents, and I'd like to set up a meeting. We've actually been watching Mrs. Hartwell for several months." Margaret's pulse quickened. "You have. We received tips about financial irregularities in the HOA accounts. Your evidence about the forged documents gives us grounds for a warrant. Can you come in this afternoon?" As Margaret hung up, she heard Kevin's voice from the living room. "Mom, there's a lot of cars outside." She found him standing at the front window, his hands flapping slightly as he processed the unusual activity. The stimming was his way of managing overwhelming sensory input. And Margaret's heart ached, knowing that even this moment of justice came with stress for her son. "It's okay, sweetheart. The reporters are here to tell everyone about what happened." "To your garden?" Kevin nodded solemnly. "Are they going to make the bad lady stop being mean?" "I hope so. I'm Dorothy Walsh. I live on Maple Street, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For standing up to Linda? She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, and most of us were too afraid to fight back." Dorothy's voice shook slightly. "She tried to force me to remove my memorial garden for my husband because she said it was depressing." Margaret's living room filled with people sharing their stories, their anger, their relief that someone had finally said enough. She realized that Linda's reign of terror had touched nearly every household in Willowbrook Estates. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Lane had been forced to remove her bird feeders. The new gens on Elm Street were cited for their vegetable garden being inconsistent with community aesthetics. The elderly Mr. Rodriguez had been threatened with a lien for using a walker, which Linda claimed projected an image of decline. She's been systemically targeting anyone who doesn't fit her vision of the perfect suburban neighborhood. Margaret told Detective Williams that afternoon, as they sat in the county courthouse, elderly people, minorities, families with children, who have disabilities. She's turned the HOA into a weapon. Detective Williams nodded grimly. "We executed a search warrant on her home and office this morning. We found evidence of embezzlement, document forgery, and what appears to be a systematic pattern of discrimination. She's been diverting HOA funds to personal accounts for years." "How much?" "Preliminary estimates suggest over $400,000. Over the past 5 years, fake vendor contracts, inflated maintenance costs, phantom legal fees. She's been treating the HOA like her personal piggy bank." Margaret felt a mix of vindication and disgust. While families struggled to pay Linda's arbitrary fines, she'd been stealing from the very community she claimed to protect. Else, Detective Williams continued, we found surveillance equipment in her home, cameras pointed at several neighbors' houses, including yours. And we found this. She handed Margaret a manila folder. Inside were dozens of photos of Kevin playing in their backyard, close-ups of him stimming and handwritten notes documenting his daily routines. The invasion of privacy was breathtaking. But what made Margaret's blood run cold were Linda's abnormal behavior, property values at risk, disruptive child find grounds for removal, and most chilling document evidence of mental instability. She's been building a case to have Kevin removed from the neighborhood, Margaret whispered. It appears so. We also found communications with a private investigator she hired to research your family's medical history and financial situation. Margaret's hands trembled as she processed the depth of Linda's obsession. This wasn't just about a fence or a view. Linda had been systematically targeting her son, treating his autism as a threat to be eliminated. What happens now? We're filing charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, document forgery, and stalking. The district attorney is considering additional charges under the Americans with Disabilities Act. She's looking at serious prison time. As Margaret drove home, her phone buzzed with another call from Jessica Martinez. Mrs. Chen, we've received a tip that Linda Hartwell has been arrested. Can you confirm? Margaret smiled grimly. You'll have to ask the police, but I will say that justice has a way of catching up with bullies. The scene at Willowbrook Estates was chaos when Margaret arrived. Police cars lined the street, and Linda's house was surrounded by crime scene tape. Neighbors clustered in small groups, their faces mixing shock with satisfaction. Margaret spotted Linda being led to a patrol car in handcuffs, her designer clothes wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled. For a moment, their eyes met across the street. Linda's expression was pure hatred, her lips moving in what Margaret assumed were threats or curses. But there was something else in her eyes' fear. For the first time in years, Linda Hartwell was not in control. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David. Just saw the news. Is she really arrested? Yes, it's over. But even as she typed the words, Margaret wondered if it truly was over. Linda had spent years building her empire of fear and control. Her arrest was just the beginning of unraveling the damage she'd done to the community. Kevin ran to greet her as she walked through the front door, his face bright with excitement. Mom, I saw the police cars. Did they catch the bad lady? Margaret hugged her son tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. Yes, sweetheart, they caught her. Good, now my garden will be safe. Your garden will be safe. That evening, Margaret stood in her backyard with David, surveying the damage Linda had inflicted on Kevin's corner of paradise. The destroyed plants could be replaced, the scattered rocks could be rearranged. But the spray-painted slur on the fence would serve as a reminder of how far some people would go to hurt a child. We should paint over it, David suggested. Not yet. Margaret's voice was firm. I want everyone to see what kind of person Linda really is. Let them see the hate she was spreading. As if summoned by her words, Dorothy Walsh appeared at the gate, carrying a plate of homemade cookies. I thought you and Kevin might like these, and I wanted to ask what do we do now? About the HOA, I mean. Margaret had been thinking about the same question. With Linda's arrest, the entire HOA structure had collapsed. There were no legitimate board members, no properly elected leadership, no accountability for years of financial mismanagement. We start over, Margaret said. We hold real elections, establish proper oversight, and create an HOA that actually serves the community instead of terrorizing it. Would you consider running for president? Dorothy asked. I think a lot of people would support you. Margaret looked at her fence, still standing despite Linda's threats. Beyond it, she could see the pond and walking trail that had drawn them to this neighborhood. It was beautiful, peaceful, and exactly the kind of place she wanted Kevin to. Grow up, I'll think about it. Over the next week, the true scope of Linda's crimes became clear. Channel 7's investigative team uncovered a pattern of financial fraud spanning 8 years. Linda had created shell companies to inflate maintenance costs, charged residents for services never provided. Margaret should have known that Linda Hartwell wouldn't go quietly into the night. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Linda's arrest. when Margaret found her car's tires slashed and the word traitor keyed across the driver's side door. The police dutifully took a report, but with Linda in county jail awaiting trial, the vandalism felt like a ghost haunting the neighborhood. "It's escalating," Detective Williams warned during their meeting that afternoon. "Linda's been making calls from jail. We can't monitor all of them. But we know she's been in contact with her sister in Phoenix and several former HOA board members from other communities." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What kind of calls? The kind that suggests she's not done with you or your family?" The second sign came that evening when Margaret received a certified letter from Hartwell, Kingston & Associates, a law firm she'd never heard of. The letter, printed on expensive letterhead, informed her that she was being sued for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The damages sought were staggering $2.5 million. David found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the legal document with numb disbelief. "This is insane," he said after reading it. "She's the one who committed fraud. It doesn't matter." Margaret's voice was hollow. "She's trying to bankrupt us with legal fees. Even if we win, we'll lose our house-paying lawyers." Kevin appeared in the doorway, his backpack slung over his shoulder, ready for school. But his usual morning routine was disrupted by the tension radiating from his parents, and Margaret could see the familiar signs of anxiety building in his posture. "Mom, why do you look scared?" Margaret forced a smile. "Just some grown-up problems, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But Kevin was too perceptive to be fooled. His eyes darted between his parents, processing the emotional undercurrents. With the hyper-awareness that came with his autism, "Is the bad lady still trying to hurt us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, extended far beyond the walls of county jail. "I won't let her hurt you," Margaret said firmly. "That's a promise." As David drove Kevin to school, Margaret called the phone number on the legal letterhead. The receptionist who answered was professionally cold. Wright's attorney who'd reached out after seeing the news coverage. Sarah had offered to represent Margaret pro bono if Linda attempted legal retaliation. "This is exactly what I expected," Sarah said after reviewing the lawsuit. "It's called ASLEP Suits Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. The goal isn't to win. It's to silence you through financial intimidation. Can they do that? They can try, but California has strong anti-SLAPP laws, and your case is textbook protected speech. You are reporting actual crimes to appropriate authorities." Margaret felt a flicker of hope, but it died quickly when Sarah continued. "However, I need to warn you. Even frivolous lawsuits can drag on for months, and Linda's family has resources. This could get ugly before it gets better."
The third sign
Came that afternoon when Margaret arrived to pick up Kevin from school and found his teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, waiting with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Chen, we need to talk." Kevin had a difficult day. Margaret's heart sank. Kevin had been thriving at Willowbrook Elementary, his teachers finally understanding his needs and accommodating his learning style. What happened? A woman came to the school this morning, claiming to be a social worker. She asked questions about Kevin's behavior, his academic performance, whether he seemed properly supervised at home. She had official-looking identification. But something felt off. The blood drained from Margaret's face. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. I referred her to the principal, who asked her to leave when she couldn't provide proper authorization. But Mrs. Chen, she knew specific details about Kevin's routines." Margaret's hands trembled as she signed Kevin out of school. Linda's surveillance had been more extensive than anyone realized, and now she was weaponizing that information from behind bars. That evening, Margaret stood in her backyard, staring at the fence that had started this nightmare. The spray-painted slur had been painted over. Kevin's garden had been replanted, his sunflowers reaching toward the sky with stubborn resilience. "Mom." Kevin's voice was small, uncertain. "Are we going to have to move?" Margaret turned to find her son standing in the doorway, his favorite stuffed dinosaur clutched against his chest. She realized he'd been listening to her phone calls. "No, sweetheart, we're not moving anywhere, but the bad lady is still being mean to us." Margaret knelt down to Kevin's eye level, taking his hands in hers. "Kevin, sometimes when people are very angry about losing, they try to keep fighting, even when the fight is over. But that doesn't mean they can win." Exactly like that. And what happened to Tommy? Kevin's face brightened slightly. Margaret hugged her son tightly, drawing strength from his simple wisdom. "The fence is still ours, Kevin, The garden is still ours, and no one can take them away from us. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret wondered if they were true. Linda's legal assault was just beginning, and she clearly had allies willing to help her wage war from prison. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy Walsh. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Something's wrong with the bank accounts." The community center was packed when Margaret arrived, but the atmosphere was tense rather than celebratory. Dorothy stood at the front of the room, her face pale with worry. "I've been trying to access the HOA accounts to begin legitimate financial management," Dorothy announced, "but I've discovered that Linda emptied them before her arrest. Every account, funds, reserve funds, emergency repairs, all of it. Nearly $180,000 gone." The room erupted in angry voices. Mr. Rodriguez stood up, his walker trembling in his grip. "What does this mean for our maintenance fees? For repairs?" "It means we're broke," Dorothy said simply. "The streetlights that burned out last month, we can't replace them. The community pool that needs repairs, we can't afford it. The landscaping contract expires next week, and we have no money to renew it." Margaret felt the weight of community expectations settle on her shoulders. As the newly elected HOA president, these people were looking to her for solutions. But how could she fix damage that had been years in the making? Some kind of protection against theft. "Linda canceled the insurance policy 6 months ago," Dorothy replied, "claimed it was an unnecessary expense." The meeting devolved into chaos, neighbors arguing about assessments, emergency loans, and whether they should disband the HOA entirely. Margaret stood at the back of the room, watching the community she'd helped unite begin to fracture under financial pressure. "What are you going to do?" asked a voice behind her. Margaret turned to find Richard Hartwell, Linda's estranged husband, standing in the shadows. His presence caused a ripple of tension through the room, but his expression was genuinely remorseful. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I do." Richard's voice was quiet but firm. He walked to the front of the room, and the crowd gradually quieted. "My name is Richard Hartwell. I know most of you hate me, and you have every right to. I stood by while my wife destroyed this community, and I'm ashamed of my cowardice." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Where's our money?" "Gone," Richard said simply. "Linda spent it on vacations, home improvements, and legal fees. But I have something that might help." He pulled out a manila envelope. "I have records of every fraudulent transaction, every diverted fund, every fake invoice." He handed the envelope to Margaret. "I also have this." The amount visible to the entire room, $180,000. The silence was deafening. "It's my inheritance from my mother," Richard continued. "I was saving it for retirement, but this community deserves better than to suffer for my wife's crimes. Consider it restitution." Margaret stared at the check, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Richard, we can't accept this." "Yes, you can. It's the least I can do." His voice broke slightly. "I watched Linda target your son, and I said nothing. I watched her destroy people's lives, and I did nothing. This is my chance to finally do something right." The room erupted in discussion, but Margaret barely heard it. She was thinking about Kevin. The anonymous letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, slipped under Margaret's front door while the family slept. No postmark, no return address, just her name scrawled in block letters across cheap white paper. Inside, a single photograph made. Her blood turned to ice. Kevin, walking home from school, circled in red marker with coordinates written in the margin and a timestamp from yesterday. "David," Margaret's voice cracked as she called up the stairs. "We need to talk. Now." Her husband found her in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, staring at the photograph with shaking hands. When he saw the image, his face went white. "Someone was watching our son yesterday." Margaret's voice was deadly calm, taking pictures, tracking his movements. David grabbed his phone, fingers flying over the screen. "I'm calling Detective Williams and Kevin's school." "And wait," Margaret caught his arm. "Look at this." She pointed to the coordinates written in the margin. David pulled up a mapping app and entered the numbers. The location that appeared made them both go silent. The parking lot of Willowbrook Elementary, taken from the roof of the building across the street. "Professional surveillance," David whispered. "This isn't some random stalker. Someone paid good money for this." Margaret's phone rang. Detective Williams' number flashed on the screen. "Mrs. Chen, we have a problem. Linda Hartwell posted bail. An hour ago, the words hit Margaret like a physical blow. How is that possible? You said her sister in Phoenix put up her house as collateral, $500,000. Linda's out, and she's already violated the restraining order. What do you mean? She drove past your house twice this morning. Our patrol unit spotted her, but by the time they could respond, she was gone. Margaret sank into a chair, the photograph crumpling in her grip. She's escalating. We're increasing patrols in your neighborhood, and I'm recommending you consider temporary relocation until no. Margaret's voice was steel. We're not running. This is our home. After she hung up, Margaret found herself staring at Kevin's bedroom door. He was still sleeping, unaware that his world had shifted again overnight. How many times could she promise him safety when that promise kept being tested? David was already moving, checking window locks and calling a security company. But Margaret knew that no amount of cameras or alarm systems could protect them from Linda's real weapon, the system itself, the courts, the licensing boards, the social services, all the official channels that Linda was using to dismantle their lives piece by piece. Mom, Kevin's voice came from the top of the stairs. Why does everything feel scary today? Margaret looked up at her son, his dark hair tousled from sleep, his perceptive eyes already reading the tension in the room. His autism made him hypersensitive. 2 emotional undercurrents, and the anxiety radiating from his parents was probably overwhelming his nervous system. Come here, sweetheart. Kevin padded down the stairs and climbed into Margaret's lap, something he rarely did anymore at 8 years old. But today, they both needed the comfort of closeness. Are we in danger? Kevin asked simply. Margaret had always been honest with her son, adapting complex truths to his level of understanding. Now she faced the hardest truth of all. We're in danger, and she didn't know how to protect him. The bad lady is out of jail, Margaret said carefully. She's still angry, and she might try to scare us. But we're not going to let her win, right? Right? Even if she tries really, really hard to be mean. Margaret held her son tighter. Even then, by noon, Linda's campaign of terror had shifted into high gear. David received a call from his company's HR department. An anonymous complaint had been filed claiming he'd misrepresented his credentials on his employment application. Margaret's car insurance was suddenly canceled due to fraudulent claims she'd never made. Kevin's school received a visit from Child Protective Services, triggered by a report of educational neglect and possible abuse. Each attack was carefully orchestrated to avoid criminal charges while maximizing disruption. Linda had clearly spent her time in jail planning every move, every pressure point, every way to destroy their lives without technically breaking any laws. Margaret sat in the principal's office at Willowbrook Elementary, facing a CPS investigator whose cold professionalism reminded her of Linda herself. Mrs. Chen, we've received reports that your son exhibits concerning behaviors at school. Repetitive, movements, social isolation, possible developmental delays that aren't being properly addressed. Margaret's jaw clenched. Kevin has autism. His behaviors are well documented and managed through his IEP. He's thriving academically and socially. The report suggests otherwise. It claims you've been resistant to professional recommendations and may be denying your son necessary treatment. What report? From whom I'm not at liberty to say, but I'll need to observe Kevin in his home environment and review his medical records. Margaret knew this was another of Linda's weapons using the system's obligation to protect children. As a way to invade and disrupt their family, the irony was bitter. The woman who'd spray-painted slurs targeting Kevin was now posing as his advocate. Of course, Margaret said evenly, Kevin's welfare is our top priority, but I want everything documented and I want our attorney present. The investigator's expression flickered with surprise. Most parents facing CPS inquiries were intimidated, compliant, eager to avoid conflict. Margaret's calm insistence on legal representation suggested she knew exactly what was happening. That afternoon, Margaret stood in her backyard, staring at the fence that had started everything. The sunflowers Kevin had replanted were blooming again, their bright faces turned toward the sun with stubborn optimism. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in a house of cards, and Linda was methodically removing each supporting piece. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, her attorney. Emergency meeting, 4 p.m. We have developments. Sarah's office was a sanctuary of calm professionalism, but her expression was grim when Margaret arrived. "I have good news and bad." "News," Sarah began. "The good news is that Linda's SLAPP suit is falling apart. I've filed our anti-SLAPP motion, and the judge is clearly sympathetic. We'll get it dismissed, and Linda will owe you attorney's fees. And the bad news, Linda's hired Bennett and Associates. They're one of the most aggressive firms in the state, specializing in destroying people through legal warfare. They've filed 16 separate actions against you and David. Employment discrimination, insurance fraud, tax evasion, child endangerment, all baseless, but each requiring separate legal responses." Margaret felt the room spin slightly. How many lawyers would that require? More than you can afford. Even with Richard's money covering the HOA issues, you're looking at legal bills that could reach $500,000. So she wins. Not necessarily. Sarah leaned forward. "I've been researching Linda's background, and I found something interesting. This isn't her first time doing this." Sarah pulled out a thick folder. "Linda Hartwell, formerly Linda Morrison, formerly Linda Castellanos, she's been the HOA president in 3 different communities over the past 15 years. Each time, she starts with minor rule enforcement, escalates to financial irregularities, and ends with a pattern of harassment targeting specific families." Margaret flipped through the documents, seeing a disturbing pattern emerge. In Phoenix, Linda had targeted a Hispanic family with a disabled grandfather. In Denver, she'd focused on a black family with twins who had ADHD. In Sacramento, her victim had been a single mother whose son was transgender. She has a type, Margaret realized: vulnerable families, people who are different, and she's very good at working within the system to destroy them. "But here's the thing, I found 2 families who fought back, and they won." Sarah handed Margaret another file. "Meet Dr. Jennifer Walsh and her son Marcus, Phoenix, 2019. Marcus has cerebral palsy, and Linda tried to force them out, using ADA compliance issues as a weapon. Dr. Walsh is a civil rights attorney who turned the tables. What happened? Linda ended up facing federal charges for disability discrimination. Dr. Walsh also discovered that Linda had been using HOA funds to pay for her own legal battles, which qualified as racketeering under RICO statutes." Margaret felt a spark of hope. "Could we do the same thing?" "Possibly, but it would require something I'm not sure you're prepared for." "What? We'd need to go nuclear, file federal civil rights charges, RICO allegations, and coordinate with victims from her previous communities. It would be a massive undertaking, and Linda would retaliate with everything she has." Margaret thought about the photograph of Kevin, about the fake social worker, about her son asking if he should try to be normal to avoid making people angry. What's the alternative? You could move, change your names, start over somewhere else, and let her win and survive. Margaret sat in silence for a long moment, watching traffic pass outside Sarah's office window. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that somewhere nearby, a small family was fighting for the right to exist without fear. "I need to discuss this with David, of course, but Margaret, if you decide to fight, you need to understand. What you're choosing, Linda won't just come after you legally. She'll make your lives hell in every way possible, and there's no guarantee we'll win." That evening, Margaret and David sat at the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles had never seen anything quite like the crowd that gathered on the morning of October 15th. What had started as a neighborhood dispute over 6 inches of fence height had evolved into United States v. Linda Morrison Castellanos Hartwell, a landmark federal case involving RICO violations, civil rights crimes, and a conspiracy that spanned 3 states and 15 years. Margaret stood on the courthouse steps, Kevin's small hand tucked securely in hers, watching news crews set up their equipment. Her son wore his best button-down shirt and the dinosaur tie David had bought him specially for today. At 9 years old now, Kevin had grown taller, more confident, but still maintained the serious intensity that made him wise beyond his years. "Mom, are there really people here from other states?" Kevin asked, his eyes wide as he took in the crowd. "Yes, sweetheart. Remember Dr. Walsh and her son Marcus? They drove here from Phoenix, and the Martinez family came from Denver." Kevin nodded solemnly. Over the past 6 months, he'd met other children who'd been targeted by Linda's campaigns of harassment. Marcus Walsh, whose cerebral palsy had made him Linda's target in Phoenix. The Martinez twins, whose ADHD had triggered Linda's wrath in Denver. Sophie Chun-No, relation whose transgender identity had made her family Linda's victims in Sacramento. What had amazed Margaret was watching these children connect with each other, forming friendships built on shared understanding of what it meant to be different in a world that sometimes punished difference. Kevin had blossomed in these relationships, finally meeting other kids who understood that being unique wasn't something to hide. Mrs. Chen, a familiar voice, made Margaret turn. Richard Hartwell approached, looking older and grayer than when she'd last seen him. His testimony had been crucial to the federal case, providing insider knowledge of Linda's methods and access to financial records that proved the scope of her crimes. "Richard, you came. I needed to see this through." His voice was quiet but determined. "I needed to watch her answer for what she did to your family." To all these families, Margaret followed his gaze across the crowd and spotted Linda near the courthouse entrance, surrounded by her expensive legal team. Even facing federal charges, Linda maintained her air of supreme confidence, her platinum hair perfectly styled, her designer suit immaculate. She was talking animatedly to her lawyers, gesturing with the same imperious authority she'd once wielded over neighborhood disputes. "She still thinks she's going to win," Margaret observed. "She's about to learn differently." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of depositions, document discovery, and media attention. Sarah Chen and Dr. Jennifer Walsh had assembled a legal team that included civil rights attorneys, federal prosecutors, and investigators who'd uncovered the full scope of Linda's criminal enterprise. The evidence was staggering. Linda hadn't just been embezzling HOA fund sheet, been running an elaborate fraud scheme across multiple communities. Fake vendor contracts, inflated legal fees, phantom maintenance costs, and kickbacks from contractors had netted her over $2.3 million across 15 years. But more damaging were the civil rights violations, systematic targeting of families with disabled children, racial minorities, and LGBTQ individuals, using HOA rules as weapons of discrimination. Margaret, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, appeared at her elbow, her own son Marcus beside her in his wheelchair. "Ready for this?" Margaret looked down at Kevin, who was chatting quietly with Marcus about dinosaurs and space exploration. Despite everything they'd endured, Kevin had emerged stronger, more confident in his own identity. The fence still stood in their backyard, and his sunflower garden had become a neighborhood gathering place where children of all abilities played together, more than ready. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed with victims, supporters, and media representatives. Margaret found herself seated in the front row, Kevin beside her, surrounded by other families who'd suffered under Linda's reign of terror. Behind them sat neighbors from Willowbrook Estates, teachers from Kevin's school, and disability rights advocates who'd turned the case into a rallying cry for inclusive communities. Linda sat at the defendant's table, her back straight, her expression defiant. She'd refused every plea bargain offer, insisting she was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by troublemakers who couldn't follow simple rules. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the court to order, and the final phase of Linda's reckoning began. Federal prosecutor James Rodriguez stood to deliver his opening statement, his voice carrying the weight of justice, delayed but not denied. "And gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power and how it can corrupt." The defendant, Linda Hartwell, used her position as HOA president not to serve her communities, but to terrorize families who didn't fit her narrow vision of suburban perfection. She targeted children with disabilities, families of color, and anyone who dared to challenge her authority. He turned toward Linda, his voice hardening. Over 15 years, the defendant stole over $2 million, violated federal civil rights laws dozens of times, and caused immeasurable psychological damage to children whose only crime was being different. Today, we ask you to hold her accountable for those crimes. Linda's defense attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named Jonathan Pierce, tried to paint her as an overzealous but well-meaning community leader who'd been manipulated by disgruntled residents with personal agendas, but the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret testified about the forged documents, the financial fraud, and the escalating harassment that had culminated in surveillance of her son. Her voice remained steady as she described finding the photograph of Kevin, the spray-painted slur on their fence, and Linda's systematic campaign to destroy their family's livelihood. "Did you ever consider giving up?" Prosecutor Rodriguez asked. Margaret glanced toward Kevin, who was sitting in the gallery with David, his dinosaur backpack at his feet. "No. My son taught me that when someone is being hurt because they're different, you have to stand up and say it's wrong, even when it's scary." Richard Hartwell's testimony was devastating. He detailed Linda's private rants about undesirable neighbors, her financial schemes, and her obsession with controlling every aspect of community life. Most damaging was his revelation that Linda had maintained files on dozens of families, documenting everything from children's medical conditions to family income. Using the information to identify vulnerabilities she could exploit, Dr. Jennifer Walsh testified about Linda's pattern of behavior across multiple communities, showing how she'd refined her methods over the years, becoming more sophisticated in her discrimination while maintaining plausible deniability. But it was Marcus Walsh's testimony that brought several jurors to tears. At 12 years old, Marcus spoke with quiet dignity about what it felt like to be targeted for his disability, to have his family's right to live peacefully challenged simply because he used a wheelchair. "She made my parents scared," Marcus said simply. "She made them think about moving away from our home because I was different." But Kevin's mom showed us that you don't have to be afraid of bullies. You can fight back. The defense's case crumbled under the weight of evidence. Linda's former allies refused to testify on her behalf, and several actually provided additional evidence of her crimes. HOA board members from other communities came forward with their own stories of financial irregularities and discriminatory practices. Linda herself chose not to testify, but her lack of remorse was evident in every interaction. With the court, even facing federal prison time, she maintained her air of superiority, rolling her eyes during victim testimony and whispering dismissively to her lawyers. The turning point came during closing arguments when Prosecutor Rodriguez displayed a photograph of Linda's surveillance files on the courtroom screen. Dozens of families, their personal information cataloged and annotated with Linda's handwritten assessments. Problematic child, find grounds for removal. Minority family, monitor for violations. Disabled resident, ADA complications. "This is what systematic discrimination looks like," Rodriguez told the jury. "This is what happens when prejudice meets power and operates without accountability." The defendant didn't just break laws, she weaponized an entire system against the most vulnerable members of her communities. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The words rang through the courthouse like a bell tolling the end of Linda's reign of terror. Margaret felt Kevin squeeze her hand as the verdicts were read. Racketeering, wire fraud, mail fraud, civil rights violations, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Each count carried substantial prison time. Linda's reaction was swift and predictable. She turned toward the gallery, her face twisted with rage, and screamed at Margaret, "This is all your fault! You destroyed everything because you couldn't follow simple rules." Judge Hendricks gavelled for order as bailiffs moved to restrain Linda, but she continued her tirade. "Your freak kid should never have been allowed in a decent neighborhood. I was protecting property values from people like you." The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry voices. Linda had just confessed to exactly what the prosecution had alleged, that her actions were motivated by pure prejudice against Kevin's autism. Mrs. Hartwell, Judge Hendricks' sigh,